All right, so for my final film review, I did it on Set It Off. The main characters are Stony, Cleo, Frankie, and TT. Black Sam, Detective Strode, and Detective Waller. There's a lot of other characters, but those are the main ones that we will focus on. When the film begins, how do we know the main characters are happy? Well, starts with them all having their jobs, living their day-to-day life. I wouldn't say they were all necessarily happy, but they were content. And then they were all going about their daily lives, even though they lived in the projects, a rough neighborhood, and didn't make much money. What does the main characters want? They want money and to get out of the hood. They live in a very low-income projects community, and all they want is to get out of that. They want a better life for themselves and their children. Describe the traumatic scene that causes the characters to become deviant. Well, it's kind of different for all of them. 3 of them lose their jobs, of course. And the 4th one, finally, she loses her job as well. But Stony's brother dies. Her parents died recently, and then her brother was actually killed. And that really set her off, not only her losing her job, but that too. Stevie is trying to get her son into college. Cleo has no money, and Stevie is also working several jobs to try and get her son in college, but it's not working out too well. Cleo just has no money and is taunted about it. She just is struggling extremely hard, and now she just lost her job. TT loses her son to the state. Her son is taken away. So that was a big loss in her eyes because all she was doing was trying to provide for her son, and she had him taken away. So they all were in desperate points of their lives, and Cleo was the one that decided that they should rob a bank and convince them all to get on board. What mindset or philosophy does the characters develop to deal with their depression, anxiety, suffering, or loss after the trauma? By robbing the banks, of course, but also by binge shopping after they get the money. Now that they finally have money, which was what they wanted, they just go out and buy all the things that they've always wanted and anything that they see that they now want. What crime does the main character commit? They commit bank robbery, armed robbery, murder, attempted murder. They shoot one of the security guards at the bank, as well as the 2 detectives that close in on them. Then they drive out and are on a wild police chase with several police officers and helicopters following them. And they hit the police cars. There's lots of different things that they do, lots of different crimes that they do, but those are the main ones. Who are the victims of the criminal deviant? Of course, the bank guard that was shot, the detectives that were shot at, all the banks that were robbed, all the employees who were threatened with guns, all the employees' families who were dealing with all these crazy issues, the community, because the media was covering all these crazy bank robberies. There's a ton of victims. How does the filmmaker depict the victims? They don't really show the victims as much. They're just showing the thriller of the crime spree that these women were on. So we don't really see a whole lot from the victim's side of the point, except for the end when they're finally caught and they end up shooting the detectives and the guard. But I'm sure they were all very devastated, but they don't really depict the victims very much in the film. Apply the psychological studies to the characters in the film. So looking at the study where the psychologist talks about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, it's not just veterans and people who go to war that get it. Lots of people can get it, as she discusses. Any traumatic event that happens in your life that is very substantial can give you PTSD. And like all those things that I spoke about above that happened to them, these were all huge traumatic events that happened to them. So that caused them to have the PTSD and act, I believe, in these criminal ways. But other than that, I wouldn't say really any other psychological disorders that they had, because they were willingly doing all this. They didn't really show any other signs other than near the end where they started shooting just like crazy, spraying bullets everywhere. I would say they got to be a little crazy, or I don't know, but I wouldn't really classify it as a psychological disorder. As to what I saw from them, maybe afterwards they would have had some, but I wouldn't say they had any real psychological disorders other than PTSD from all the traumatic events that they've had to go through in their life leading up to their crimes. Do the victims of the criminal deviant demonstrate post-traumatic stress or other emotional disturbances after being a victim? Well, we don't really see any of the standpoint from them being victims, but we do see the security guard that is shot afterwards, and he's just basically bleeding out on the floor. But again, we don't really see much of the sides of the victims. The only side we really see is when the women all lose their jobs, and the one woman who worked at the bank, when she lost her job, it was because of a bank robbery, and she actually knew the robber, so that was why she was fired. But they really only depict the deviants as the victims in the film, so it's kind of hard to say if they had these, but I'm sure that they did, because being robbed, all the bank employees, that's a very traumatic event. So I'm sure that they all did have PTSD, as I explained, like the women had, the robbers had, just for different reasons, of course. According to the scientific articles and lectures, what are some other courses of action the character could have taken? So in that same video where the psychologist talks about PTSD, she also talks about the ways you can get help. There's medication, of course, but there's also therapy. She talks about how well therapy works for some people, and some people have even completely recovered from their PTSD by just going to therapy or even using medication. So if these women had sought for help, maybe they could have recovered from their PTSD before they made these crazy decisions and all ended up dying. So those are just some things, but again, that might have been hard for these women to find those resources, since they all lost their jobs and they were all very broke and in such a rough community. But overall, again, I really liked this film. It was a really intense thriller, and I enjoyed the movie because some of these actresses are some of my favorites. But yeah, that's it. Have a great day.